Welcome to the Common Ground Alaska Farmstead YouTube channel, where we share about farming, homesteading, self-sufficiency, and living our best Alaska life. Hey, it's Tandy with Common Ground Alaska. Today we're going to talk about raising meat birds in Alaska. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Cornish cross versus freedom rangers. I'm just going to share our experience. I was going to say that I didn't have an opinion, but I do have an opinion on what works best for us, but that isn't necessarily going to work best for everyone. So we're just going to share our story. We're going to share how things worked out for us, and then you can make the best decision for raising specifically meat chickens in Alaska. So let's start with our process. Our process with new chicks is that we bring them into our sunroom for a couple weeks. And the nice thing about our sunroom is it actually has a concrete floor. So we just lay down puppy pads and they have constant access to food and water. And we have heat lamps in there that hang off of the planting shelves to keep them nice and warm. And so they go in there for the first couple weeks. We don't usually get our meat chicks until the first week in June because my sunroom is full of plants, as we don't plant outside until June 1st. And so my sunroom is full of plants until June 1st. So I usually try and get our meat chicks right around the 1st of June, and we'll get the plants out and bring the meat chicks in. And so they get to be in there by themselves and they're just on puppy pads. Tends to be better for their legs, easier for their legs than it was for them to try and maneuver some sawdust or some of those pine shavings. So that's how we start them out. Around week 2.5 or 3, they move outside to our little coop. And so that's where they get a little bit hardier. They're outside. They still get some heat, but only as needed. And there's usually some hay on the floor, or we'll put wood chips on the floor, just whatever we happen to have. And that's how they acclimate to being outside. That usually happens about week 2.5 or 3. They can go maybe 5 days or so when they're young, because they're not eating as much, they're not pooping as much, they're just not making as big a mess. But by the end, we're usually moving it sometimes every day, sometimes every 2 days. Last year was pretty rainy, so the grass didn't grow as fast, so we were moving them every day there at the end, and we grow 100 at a time, so they take up quite a bit of space. So that's our process for growing chickens. We also do ferment their feed. So we'll go into that a little bit later, but I highly recommend fermenting their feed, and we have a video on that as well. Okay, but today's topic is not really about how to grow chicks. It's more, we have grown Freedom Rangers and we've grown Cornish cross, and I just wanted to share our experience with both, because it's hard to know sometimes exactly what the advantages are to either one. For instance, I've had conversations with people where they say, of course, I'm going to grow Cornish cross because they're so much cheaper to raise. That's fine. If that's your number one goal is to raise cheap meat, then it's true. Cornish cross probably is the way to go. But there's lots of things to consider when you're raising a Cornish cross chicken. And there are some other things to be thinking about too, some other information to weigh in when you're deciding what to go with. Let's start with Cornish cross. I will say that we've grown egg chickens for as long as I can remember. We would bring in shipments of egg chicks every year, and we didn't seem to have a lot of trouble with them. There might be an issue with one or two, but I don't remember ever having mass casualty issues with our egg layers. When we started raising meat chickens, we started with Cornish cross, and that's what we did for the first several years. And it seemed like we just had a really high mortality rate, and I was having a hard time getting ahead of it. We give them the prebiotics and probiotics that they're supposed to have. We'd put things in their water to help them thrive. But 2 years ago, the last year that we grew Cornish cross, we ordered 50 and we lost 10 in the first 5 days, which that was really high. And I'm not sure what exactly happened, but that was really disheartening when this is your meat for the year and we lost 10 chicks in the very beginning. When we got them, they just weren't thriving. Some of them were, but definitely some of them weren't just the happiest. So that's one thing to consider, is maybe talk with someone who raises them successfully and find out what are the issues specifically with Cornish cross and how you can get in front of that. We don't intend to ever raise Cornish cross again, so I'm not really well versed on that. We called that first issue failure to thrive. I'm not sure exactly what the problem was, but we've had a higher mortality rate of Cornish cross than we have with any of the other chickens that we've ever grown here on the farm. The other issue that we had was they get leg issues. Sometimes they get them when they were young, and most of that really was alleviated when we started just putting the puppy pads down on the floor and didn't have any sawdust or anything for the first little bit. That did tend to help. But so the leg issues when they're young, that is one resolution, is just not to give them anything to be stumbling over that's going to be constantly sliding out from under them. And then pasty butt, but we haven't found a breed yet that doesn't tend to have that. So that's just part of it. One of the differences that we noticed, though, between Cornish cross and all of the other breeds of birds is that there tends to be issues from start to finish. And again, I'm not trying to convince you not to raise Cornish cross, but if you do want to grow them, here are definitely some things to be looking into to make sure that you're successful. Because if you're growing your meat, you really want to get as many as you can and grow as much meat as you possibly can. That's the whole goal. It was interesting to see how they, from the time you get them until the time you butcher them, I never really felt like, okay, we're in the clear. These guys are safe. They're healthy. Everybody looks good. It seemed there just was all, I was waiting for the other shoe to drop or the other chicken to drop, as awful as that sounds, but just all through their lives, they'd suddenly stop eating. They would just die or they'd get leg issues that we'd have a hard time. But then, of course, when they get leg issues, if they're big enough, you can at least butcher them and still salvage the meat. But that was something that I thought maybe was typical for meat birds until we grew Freedom Rangers. So with Freedom Rangers, once we got past the trauma of that first day, which we lost one chick when we brought in our Freedom Rangers, we got 100 and we lost one chick. And that chick was actually dropped when she was being moved from the container by the distributor that we bought her from. She was dropped from, so that could have been what caused that. It's definitely a possibility that it wasn't even an issue with the chick itself. One difference that we noticed with the Cornish cross versus all of the other breeds that we've grown, whether they were meat birds or birds that we were growing for eggs, was that the issues can happen from birth to butchering. With most chickens, it seems like there's that kind of volatile first day or two where they've traveled. My goodness, that's a big, long trip for them. And it's a long time to go to just be jostled around and not have food. And so there is that, it does make sense that there's that time where things are a little iffy. But then for most chickens, it's always seemed now we've gotten past that point. Now we can coast a little bit. We can be watching for pasty butt, watch to see if someone acts like they're getting sick. But for the most part, once you've made it past those first couple days, you can kind of cruise. That was not the case with the Cornish cross. It seemed like they had issues from start to finish. So things could happen. Their legs may just not want to work for them, especially when they start getting too big, which at least in that case, you can salvage the meat. But some of them just die. And understanding is they have a heart attack because they get too big. We try not to let that happen with them, but that's just not normal. A lot of times, if they would get very big, then they didn't want to walk to their food. We tend to have their food and water separate. It forces them to move around. They'd want to quit walking to their food. They just didn't super thrive. So that's just something to consider with Cornish cross. We do keep everything super clean in the barn. We feed everyone the same exact feed, except like I said before, we did start fermenting our feed, and that may have something to do with why the Cornish cross did, or excuse me, why the Freedom Rangers did so well last year, because they really thrived. They just had an amazing success rate, and we did start fermenting our feed. And I'll link to that in the show notes, the fermented feed video that we made. We will definitely always ferment feed from here on out. I'm not always sure what the issues were. And again, we just called it failure to thrive. The last batch that we did, we started with 50. And like I said before, 10 died before they even moved outside. That was a bummer. However, there are some pretty amazing things about the Cornish cross breed. One of them is when folks say they grow fast, they are not kidding. Holy moly. These guys, by the time we move them out to the coop at about 2.5 to 3 weeks, they're half grown. This is incredible. They only spend a few days in there in the little coop, and then they can go right down to the barn and have their just normal, live out their rest of their normal life, which is not very much longer. You could easily do 2 rounds of Cornish cross up here in the summer. You may even be able to do 3 if you really wanted to. And if you have a small area, that might be the thing to do. You could grow a year's worth of meat on a very small area and just have multiple batches. You'd have to check and make sure, see when the latest time is that you can bring the chicks in. That's something to consider, because you wouldn't want to be expecting to start a batch like on the 1st of August and then find out nobody's bringing chicks up in August, or you can't order them and get them yourself in August. Definitely check into that, but that's one advantage and one reason that a person might grow the Cornish cross. Here's where I got a little frustrated with the Cornish crosses, if I haven't shared enough, right? But some did really well in the grassy field, but most of the Cornish cross didn't really forage. They didn't really scratch around in the beautiful, we gave them this like utopian, beautiful grassy field, and they just hung out in the barn. They laid a lot. And so when they did get up, they didn't always move properly. And they weren't like jumping for bugs. They weren't scratching really. They weren't making dirt baths. They just weren't doing the normal chicken thing. So that just always bothered me. What kind of meat are we growing that the chicken doesn't act like a chicken? So that just always nagged at the back of my brain. However, we've always had some that do fine. Maybe half or a little more might do okay. Then you always wonder, is it genetics? What's making part of them do well and part of them not? But it doesn't matter. They laid around a lot. If they moved, the other thing that was frustrating was if they'd move around much, which is what we were trying to encourage. And it seemed like they were always hurting themselves. And it was like, you silly chickens. That was frustrating. But again, they grow really fast. We had 6-pound birds in between 6 and 7 weeks. So that's a really quick turnaround. They also tend to be a little more prone to water belly, which is just weird. That's something to watch for as well. Now, for the Freedom Rangers. The reason we switched to Freedom Rangers was because someone mentioned that they have more dark meat. And it was funny because in the conversation, it was very derogatory. They were like, oh, the Freedom Rangers, they're all dark meat. And they're not all dark meat. It's still, the breast is still white meat. The legs are still dark meat. But they were just like, they're all dark meat. You can't eat that stuff. And my brain was processing, we're a dark meat eating family. So if I can so I started asking, and they said, yeah, because they move around so much. So their legs are bigger, and they haven't been bred up to have that bigger breast meat. So they do tend to have more dark meat. I was like, sold, I'll take it. You're telling me that this chicken moves around like a chicken. It acts like a chicken. It's hardier, and you're going to get more dark meat. I don't care how long it takes this thing to grow out. As long as we can do it in the summer, let's do it. So that's what we did. We made the switch cold turkey. We went from growing Cornish cross to growing Freedom Rangers. We got 100 of them. So we were all in. We were not disappointed. Like I said, we ordered 100 birds, 99 made it. And I really think that the one suffered from the fall and probably would have been fine otherwise. I have no way of knowing. But I will tell you, these guys are eating machines. I had heard that although they take more time to grow out, that they would actually eat less in one sitting because they're slower to grow. So they wouldn't be more expensive than raising out a Cornish cross. So because I had read that, I believed it. And I don't know if it's an Alaska thing. I'm wondering if it's not maybe because we have so much daylight, or I don't know what it was. But our guys ate a lot of food. They ate about 20% more food per pound. So I wasn't just figuring out the timeline, because of course they're alive longer, but I was figuring out per pound how much food did each of them eat, and it was exponentially more. But we also got bigger birds out of them. I would say that it wasn't quite true that you can raise one for the same cost. But here's the best part. When we moved them out from the little coop to the barn, and we put them in the barn at night, they're all sealed up for safety. And then it was so fun. We moved their fence to wherever the next day's area is going to be. And when we'd open those doors, they would just come flying out. They were so excited and they'd go running all the way to the end of the fence and they'd be flapping and just happy chickens. They'd start pecking and scratching at the ground right away. They were so fun because they jump for bugs and they were energetic. They were just very happy chickens. They were very healthy, very happy. So that right there encouraged me to know that our Freedom Ranger chickens just seemed to be for us a better chicken to raise. But it wasn't all perfect. Before the chickens are ready to butcher, we butchered ours at 14 weeks. We butchered half of them at 14 weeks and then our plucker broke. So then we had to wait until 16 weeks to get everything rounded up for the second round. And let me tell you, chickens, 100, we had about 96 or something left. By then, we did have an eagle issue, which I'll talk about in another video because it's interesting how we managed to convince that eagle to leave our chickens alone. But the chickens, the roosters got very roostery at about 12 weeks. So we did have to deal with some fighting but it wasn't horrible. Like it wasn't, they just would, usually it was just like a standoff and then one would back off and it was fine. They got a little bit, they didn't get aggressive towards me, but they'd maybe act like from afar, they'd act, oh, I'm going to get whatever. But then if I just kept walking towards them, they were like, never mind, I'll just leave you be. So it wasn't horrible, but they did definitely peck each other some. Our 14-week chickens averaged about 7 pounds. And our 16-week chickens averaged about 8.5 pounds. We had one that was almost 10. We didn't prefer to grow them quite that big, but like I said, our plucker broke and we were kind of in a little bit of a pickle for a minute. But the cool thing about the bigger chickens was it feels like you exponentially make more meals out of that bigger chicken. Even the wings had a ton of meat. So you would eat the wings like a person would eat a drumstick. They were really big and really meaty. But here's something that's interesting that Jean and I noticed. And it was funny when we were eating them, we both thought of this at the same time. The meat from the Freedom Rangers is so much more filling and it seems like it's you much longer. It stays with you for a much longer time. When we cut up the hindquarters, and granted, they were pretty decent size, but when we cut up the hindquarters, we don't leave them whole in their freezer. We cut them up and part them before they go in the freezer. And normally in a normal chicken, I could eat, because I eat mostly meat, I could eat a leg and a thigh easily. And even though the only thing on my plate is that leg and thigh, oftentimes it's too much. I can't even eat the whole of both. I can eat most of it, but not even the whole thing. And Gene oftentimes will have potatoes or green beans or something with it, and he can only eat one piece or the other. And that seemed really different, but it's proven with every one of them. So I don't know if there's more density to the meat. Maybe it's just because they're that much bigger because the chickens were bigger. I'm not sure, but that was something else to consider, is that we're actually eating less per sitting. So a chicken goes a whole lot further. Although we prefer Freedom Rangers over Cornish Cross, I'm sure you can tell that from this, the advantages are clear for both. So I wanted to just quick bullet point the advantages to both so you can think your way through what you want to grow to provide meat for your table for this winter, right? So here's a quick recap. The Cornish Cross have more white meat. They're not as mobile, so they're happy without lots of room to forage or move around. So if you have a small space, they're probably going to be happier than a Freedom Ranger would be. They are definitely less expensive to raise. And they take less time to get to full grown. So again, with that small space, if you were just going to raise even 10 at a time, I really think you could get three batches in. You could still raise 30 chickens in a very small area. So that's something to consider for Freedom Rangers, or for Cornish Cross. However, the Freedom Rangers, you get a whole lot more dark meat and you don't have quite as much breast meat. You can grow them larger without the risk of them dying or hurting their legs. Our 9-pound chickens were super healthy. They could have continued to grow and been perfectly happy, but holy moly, do they eat. They're a hardier bird. So at least for us, the success rate is higher. When I order 100 birds, 100 Freedom Rangers, I anticipate that I'm going to butcher 95 or 96 or 97 of them. Whereas with the Cornish Cross, we did have a much higher mortality rate. Also, they forage well. They love to eat grass and bugs. They love making dust baths and they love searching for food. So they're just like I said, like Joel Salatin would say, he says the pigness of the pig. I would say the chickenness of the chicken is evident in the Freedom Ranger chickens, and they just seem happier. But either way, I would encourage you to grow out whichever one works best for your family. And remember that no matter what you're doing, you're improving your family's health by growing your food and knowing exactly what's going in it, exactly what they're being fed. And it also, you get to choose what they're being fed. Last year, or 2 years ago, we did soy-free, corn-free feed. This year, we get it from a local grower, and we'll always get it from that local grower. And so there is some corn in it. I don't think he has soy. I think he just has corn in it. And that's something that we choose. That's something that we agree is okay. But we get to choose, again, what's in our chickens' feed. We ferment their feed, so we know that it's at the maximum of the nutrition that they can be getting. And so I just want to encourage you, do it. It's great. It's so fun. And you will get attached to the little boogers, but for us, when we have 100 of them, it's a little harder to get attached to one. Happy chicken growing. If you have any questions, you can always reach out. Tandy at commongroundalaska.com. Thank you.